some notes. Those of you who have been around for a while have heard me talk about my days prior to vocational ministry. You know that I worked in the school system, that I was teaching and coaching and working with 7th through 12th grade students. And during that time, there were a lot of positive memories and a lot of great relationships that were built. But I got to admit, there were some really tough things about that time too. There were some really difficult things to see when you're dealing with young people and watching them interact with others in the school system. One of the most difficult things about that time was seeing kids who were on the outside and looking in. The kids who were eating by themselves at the lunch table, the kids who would walk through the hallways by themselves, and not just walking by themselves, but looking around and trying to avoid every other person that they were seeing to make sure they weren't coming in contact with them. The kids who would get picked on, or the kids that would get picked last for teams, the students with disabilities and those who are differently abled. It's heartbreaking to see what some of them would go through when they were being teased, when they were being bullied, with the anxiety that they carried about who they were and what other people thought about them. What was most heartbreaking is when they would begin to hurt themselves or take things into their own hands or have thoughts like, it might be better if I wasn't even around. Would anyone even notice if I wasn't here? And if you are here and ever having any of those kinds of thoughts, know that you are seen, you are loved, you are valued, and there are people who would love to talk to you about that. But it's heartbreaking when kids have those kinds of thoughts, whenever you see it going on and the way it plays out in their lives, and it happens every single day in our school systems. Now, the thing about that, though, is it's not just our kids and our teens, though. We as adults feel that same thing in our own lives many times. We know what it's like to be on the outside and looking in, to feel left out, that we don't belong. We know what it's like to be made fun of ourselves or to be ostracized in some way. It can happen in our jobs. It can happen in our neighborhoods. It can even happen in our own families where we feel like we're being pushed out or we don't even belong there. And that's a tough place to be. The flip side of that is that sometimes we're the ones who are on the inside, and we're actually the ones responsible for ostracizing others, for keeping others outside, for pushing them outside. And sometimes we do that intentionally. Other times we don't even know we're doing it. We don't even notice that people are in pain, notice that people are hurting, notice that people are grieving. And so that's the thing with some of us, is we don't even know. They're just invisible to us. We don't even recognize it whenever it's happening. Today, as we make our way through the Gospel of Luke and these few verses that we're going to look at, we're going to see Jesus come across someone who was on the outside, who knew what it was like to be on the outside looking in, and we're going to see the way that he interacts with him. It's going to say a lot to us about those of us who may feel like we're invisible ourselves. It's going to say a lot to those of us who may be on the inside and have a tendency to disregard other people or not even notice people in those situations. Look at the way that Luke starts off. Luke chapter 5, verse 12 again. He says, while Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered, or some translations just say full of leprosy. I mean, it wasn't just a little bit of leprosy, it was a lot of leprosy. I mean, covered, just full of leprosy. And if you know anything about leprosy, it's just an awful disease for someone to have to live with. It's a skin disease, and you know that. It causes severe disfiguring and sores all over you, but it also causes nerve damage. And nerve damage can be really painful. And so just the fact that you're having these disfiguring sores and whatever comes with that, and the way it affects you physically and the pain that's associated with it, I mean, that in and of itself is terrible. But I think the worst part about it, especially in this day and age, is that you were removed outside the camp. You were kicked out of your community and into isolation. Leviticus 13 gives instructions about this kind of thing. The context is dealing with people who have skin diseases. And in verse 45 of chapter 13 in Leviticus, it says, anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face, and cry out, unclean, unclean. As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp. Can you picture yourself coming down with leprosy? Being kicked out of your community. You've got to leave your spouse. You've got to leave your kids. You've got to leave your mom. You've got to leave your dad. You've got to leave your grandparents. You've got to leave your friends. You've got to give up your occupation. You've got to give up your habits and all the things that you do. You pack up. You move outside of the camp, and there's no protection outside the city walls. The protection is inside the camp, not outside the camp. It's like being sentenced to solitary confinement. And if that wasn't bad enough, you also, as the text said, had to make your appearance as repugnant as possible to scare people off, to keep people from coming too close to you. And if they did get too near, as the text said, you had to yell out, unclean, unclean, stay away from me, I'm unclean, don't come near me. Can you imagine what it's like to have to live that way? Think about seeing someone that you love from a distance, or a friend from school, or mom, a dad, a grandparent, and yet you're having to unclean. I'm unclean. Stay away. Don't come near me. It's got to be awful to have to deal with that. Not to mention the fact that you're just, of course, giving up family, friends, and everything else, but also to never be touched. Don't neglect how important it is for human touch. We take it for granted, but I mean, high fives, handshakes, pats on the backs, hugs, kisses. I mean, those things are so important to us as human beings. You guys know the studies, or have heard about the studies of infants that they've done, and they've found how awful it is when babies don't receive touch deprivation, right? It impacts them physically and psychologically, and they have issues with growth and emotional regulation and social bonding and cognitive issues and all of the things. I mean, human touch is powerful, and it is necessary. Something we need. There's so much warmth and feelings of belonging that we experience in human touch. But when you have leprosy, you give all that up. It's no longer a part of your life. So dealing with leprosy is a miserable and a lonely disease to have. You're truly on the outside looking in. That's this man's situation that Luke introduces us to when he's covered with leprosy. He's in pain. He's in misery. He's lonely. He's isolated. He's got feelings of rejection, probably feelings of shame and depression and a host of all other emotions. And this is who he introduces us to. Let's see what Luke says happens next. Verse 12 continues, when he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And the text says that he fell with his face to the ground. You see the humility in the way that he approaches Jesus. You bow before someone who's superior. You know, he even addresses it in the way he talks to him. Lord, he addresses him Lord. The Greek word's Kyrios. It means master, Lord. It's the same word that was used for the Roman emperor, Kyrios, master, Lord. It's someone in authority, someone in power, someone who's your superior. And so obviously this is the way the man with leprosy viewed Jesus. But look at his request. His request that he makes doesn't center around Jesus being capable. He doesn't say, Jesus, are you able to heal me? He says, are you willing to do so? In other words, I have faith that you can. I believe that you can heal me, but are you willing to do so? Why would he ask that? Probably because he didn't feel like he was worthy to be healed. He felt like he was beyond the reach of God's mercy. He was a nobody. He was one of the invisibles of the world. He was on the outside looking in. He was ritually unclean, which had associations of sin. And so besides being a nobody and invisible and untouchable and on the outside looking in, he's an unclean, dirty, rotten sinner in the eyes of the world. And so in his mind, Jesus probably isn't willing to heal someone like him. And so he approaches him with the most humble way that he knows how. Face to the ground, timidly saying, Lord, if you're willing. I mean, you're probably not. I get it. You're probably not willing to heal a guy like me. I'm an unclean sinner. I'm a nobody. I'm someone on the outside. I'm invisible, untouchable of the world, but I'm just asking just in case. I'm sure for many of you who are here today, the hardest part about hearing this guy's story is that you can relate. You feel the same way. It's not because of leprosy, but you know what it feels like to be an unclean sinner. You know what it feels like to be a nobody. You know what it feels like to be one of the invisibles or the untouchables in our world today. And so however Jesus is going to respond here to this guy is going to say a lot, not about just this man, but a lot about you and the situation that you find yourself in this morning. So let's see how Jesus responds. Verse 13, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said. Be clean. And immediately, we're told, the leprosy left him. We see Jesus' power again, his strength, that it's not a gradual healing, it's just an immediate healing, and the leprosy was gone. But another couple of things to highlight and point out here. First and foremost, the guy had approached him in the most humble way. And, if you're willing, you're probably not. I get it if you're not. It's okay if you're not. And Jesus looks at him and he says, I am willing. What's he saying? I see you. You matter to me. You're important to me. I care about you and the situation that you're in and what you're feeling and what you're going through. I am willing. But notice what Luke tells us even before that. The very beginning of the verse, before saying I'm willing, before saying I'm clean and actually healing him, Luke tells us that Jesus reached out his hand and he touched the man. Now listen, Jesus could have done it the other way, which is probably what most of us would have done if we had the power to heal someone with just words, right? I mean, if we felt the need to touch the guy, then most of us would go, man, those sores are ugly, they're nasty, they're gross, and we need to get rid of those. And if I can say the words and get rid of those, then you can come in for a hug. Says so much about Jesus, though, because he doesn't wait for that. He reached out towards the man. And remember, put yourself back in this guy's shoes. You're someone that had to move outside of the camp. You've been isolated from the people that you love for who knows how long. Not only that, every time you've come across someone, you've had to yell out, unclean, unclean, stay away from me. You've been forced to make your appearance as repugnant as possible, scare people away from coming too close. You're so used to seeing people see you and turn and run the other way, and yet Jesus moves towards you. He doesn't run the other direction, he moves towards you. He reaches out and he touches the man's sores, he touches his scars, he touches his unclean skin. I imagine, the text doesn't say this, but I can't believe that Jesus would be doing one of these things where he was like, Okay, got it. You're healed. Like, I just got to touch a little spot. There's got to be one spot on here that's clean. That looks like a good one right there. I can't imagine that was the case because he didn't have to touch him to heal him in the first place. So if he didn't have to touch him in order to do the healing, what's the touching about? It's about communicating his value and love. He was making sure that this man knew that he was loved just as he was. The leprosy didn't have to go away. He didn't have to become clean in order to be loved and valued and liked and worthy of an embrace. He says, I love you just the way you are. And I imagine that, again, the text doesn't say this, but I can't imagine that Jesus did any other way other than, maybe first grabbing his cheeks and looking him in the eyes as only Jesus could do to communicate that love and that value and compassion and like, I see you. Notice me noticing you, right? And then probably pulling him in. And you've had those hugs before when someone really pulls you in, and sometimes they even grab the back of your head. I mean, someone you really love and value, and you're coming in and your cheek actually touches up against their cheek. I mean, you're a warm embrace, bear hug kind of thing. And I just can't imagine that Jesus didn't do it any other way. Sores, skin, a guy who hasn't felt human touch for who knows how long, people running the other direction, and Jesus is just giving him a warm bear hug, face-to-face skin, and tears are probably welling up in this guy's eyes, feeling touched for the first time in who knows how long. Notice what that says about you and I as well. Jesus is not afraid to enter into whatever situation and circumstance you find yourself in. No matter how far you've gone in some kind of sin and the place that you've ended up, no matter how unclean you feel you are, no matter how unworthy you feel like you are, Jesus reaches towards you, not away from you. He loves you just as you are. No matter if you've been on the outside looking in, no matter if you've been invisible to other people, you're used to people moving away from you and not towards you to avoid you, you're seen by Jesus. He doesn't move away from you, but towards you because he loves you as you are. My hope and my prayer is that you would receive his touch, you would receive his embrace, you would receive his love today. Jesus goes on, or Luke goes on, in verse 14. It says, then Jesus ordered him, don't tell anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. What's this all about? A couple of things that Jesus was doing here. Remember, Jesus was ministering to and serving people who lived under an old covenant. The new covenant had not started yet because the new covenant starts at Jesus' death and through his resurrection and the sending of the Spirit. And so these were people living under the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. And in order to be moved from the outside of the camp to come back to the inside of the camp, you first had to be pronounced unclean by a priest. And so he's telling him to go do that thing. And the priest would examine him, see that his leprosy was gone, walk through all of the process of becoming ritually clean again, and he had to move back from outside the camp into the camp and with his family and all the things that he used to participate in. The second thing is that Jesus is using it as a testimony to the religious leaders. These people didn't know. They knew about the Messiah that was to come, and this is one of those things that pointed to him being more than just a man, more than just a prophet, that he was the Messiah. And so I think he wanted to share it as a testimony to the priest that he would be going to. The priest didn't have the power to heal. They just pronounced someone clean or unclean. And here's someone who had the power above and beyond them to heal the guy. But why did he tell them not to tell anyone? Don't tell anyone. Just go tell the priests. Again, we don't know for sure. Jesus did this a number of times. Most likely, he knew that it would cause a frenzy. This is the kind of thing that people notice and might bring attention to the Roman authorities, might bring attention to the Jewish leaders who were against him and his ministry, and it wasn't time for those things. But regardless, Luke tells us next in the last part of this section that the news about him spread anyway. Look at verse 15. Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. And then Luke tells us, just like he did earlier, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely, or can be translated solitary, places and prayed. Jesus was in this regular rhythm of retreating for silence and solitude and spending time with his heavenly Father, enjoying his intimate relationship with him, and then getting sent back out into the world by his Father on the mission that he was on to selflessly serve people in need. This was his purpose. This was his mission. And we've been saying that Jesus is still on that mission today, 2,000 years later. He's just doing and accomplishing that mission through the church, through his sons and daughters, through you and through me. So what do we learn today about how we can expect Jesus to accomplish his mission of serving those people who are in need through us as he expresses his life through us? Because that's what he does, right? I mean, the moment we say yes to Jesus, we're completely forgiven from all of our sins. He comes to dwell in us. We're in the spiritual union with him. And then he begins to express his life and his mission through us to accomplish those things. And what we learn that he'll do in and through us is that he'll first lead us to notice the invisibles, to notice the untouchables, to highlight and to see them. And secondly, not to move away from them or around them and do our best to avoid them when we see them, but just like Jesus, to move towards them and to love and to serve them. That's what Jesus did, right? He came across someone who was invisible and untouchable, and rather than move away from them, he moved towards them, showed them value, communicated it, compassion, love, met needs, and welcomed him inside the circle and gave him a place to belong. That's what Jesus will do through us. He leads us to notice the invisibles and the untouchables of the world. And so the question becomes, what does that look like for you? Who are the invisibles? Who are the untouchables? Those on the outside looking in that Jesus wants to use you to notice and then to move towards. Is it someone in your school? Is it that kid who's sitting at the lunch table by themselves? The one walking down the hall that's getting picked on or trying to avoid every other person, getting made fun of because of their clothes or the way they act or their disability or any of those kinds of things? I love seeing those little social media videos sometimes where kids will notice kids like that and be prompted by the Spirit to meet needs and to go, they're getting picked on because they don't have great shoes or they don't fit or whatever, and all these people chip in and then they go buy them shoes and present them to him, and he's going, oh my gosh, I can't believe I am valued, I am seen, I am loved. Jesus expresses his life in us and through us to see the invisibles and the untouchables, and then empowers us to meet their needs and communicate that compassion and love to them. Welcome them into the circle. Give them a place to belong. Maybe it's not your school. Maybe you're beyond school. Maybe it's your workplace. Somebody who stays to themselves. Somebody who never gets noticed. They hardly ever get recognized. They have a hard time fitting in your workplace. Maybe they're not even that great at their job and they could use some help. And Jesus is leading you to notice them and to befriend them and come alongside of them. Is it someone in your neighborhood? Maybe it's someone that you've never even noticed in your neighborhood he's leading you to. Maybe it's someone you notice, and every time you notice them, you do your best to avoid them. But he wants you to see them, go to them, and communicate that love and compassion to them. Is it someone that's homeless? Is it someone that's in long-term care in a hospital or a nursing home and doesn't have anyone coming by to check on them, to hug them, to smile at them, or notice them? When I was at the hospital last week and ministering to and trying to serve Mike and Bobby Ogg and Stacy Skidmore's family, when she was in the hospital, I talked to Mike and he goes, Jason, I come down here and we've got family who are loving her and seeing her and talking to her and praying over her, and pastors that are coming and people from our Sunday school class and floods, and we walk down this hall and we glance in every other room and there's no one else in there except the patient. They're all by themselves. No touch, no words of encouragement, no one praying over them. They're invisible. They're the untouchables. Maybe he's leading you to someone in a hospital, to someone in a nursing home where they're not being served in this way, and he's going to use you to meet their needs. Show them compassion. Give them a hug, smile, encourage them. Maybe it's someone with disabilities. Maybe it's a parent of a child who has disabilities. Maybe they don't ever get noticed, and they're used to when they are noticed, people giving them the stink eye and just wondering when they're going to do something about their kid because they're not keeping them in check, when they have no idea what is really going on in their world. Maybe he's going to lead you to one of them, as the invisibles or the untouchables, or those who feel like they're on the outside looking in. I don't know who it is, but the Lord's wired you with a unique personality and giftings and ways that you're wired to see people, and he wants to work in and through those things to connect you to those that he breaks your heartstrings for, and then empower you to be able to meet those needs for people and be able to share the love of Jesus and welcome them inside the circle. Which is what he does. And so we make ourselves available to him. We're his instruments that he's on mission through. And as we collectively do that together, we do it as a church. We become a church who notices the invisibles, a church who notices the untouchables, a church who notices those on the outside, and we move towards them together. We embrace them together, and we welcome them home together. It's who we are. It's what we do, because it's what Jesus does in and through us.